On behalf of Campbell University and the St. Thomas More Society, we want to welcome Dr. Thompson here. We're very pleased that he's come to speak with us today. And we also want to thank Professor Kevin Lee for putting this together. And so that we don't waste a lot of time keeping you from hearing what they have to say, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Lee.
Well, thank you all for coming to this. Is this on? Yes. Yes. To the second event in our lecture series. As you know, or I hope you know, on February 1st, the Governor's Task Force reported and made the recommendation to the legislature that they award approximately $50,000 per surviving victim of the sterilization program here in North Carolina. So the context for our talk today is over at the State House, there's an ongoing debate, bipartisan debate on the nature of reparations and what will be paid. And that's framing our discussion today. In North Carolina, they estimate that something around 7,500 victims that the state sterilized over the period of the program. There may be 2,000 still alive, and the state's task force is attempting to locate those people. So today we have Dr. Phillip Thompson. Dr. Thompson is the Executive Director of the Aquinas Center of Theology at Emory University. He received his bachelor's degree from Vanderbilt University, law degree from University of Georgia, and his doctorate from the University of Chicago. That's where I met him. He's, prior to being director at the Aquinas Center, he was, I got this right here, the Patricia A. Hayes Professor of Ethics and Director of the Center for Ethics and Leadership at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. He also was at the Georgia Tech at the Institute of the Georgia Institute of Technology from 2005 to 2008, and you've been at Emory since 2008. Correct. Right. So I'm going to get out of the way here and let Dr. Thompson speak.
Thank you. Well, it's my pleasure to be here today, and this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Actually, I have more degrees in sense. One other degree I got was the Master's of Law at DePaul. But I'm not trying to add to one, but I actually wrote my thesis on the Buck versus Bell case. So for that degree, so it was in health law. So this is a case which I've written about, I've studied, I've taught. I've used the film. You saw the Lynchburg story. How many people here saw the movie, the film, documentary? Well, if you've seen that, I mean, it's absolutely stunning. And when I would end classes, typically an hour class, I tell them you can leave after the film, and students would just sit there. They wouldn't move, not a one, for 3 or 4 minutes. It took them a while to sort of take it in that this could happen in the United States of America. And it's not very well known, the case of Buck versus Bell, involuntary sterilization. I don't know any attorneys my age who knew anything about it. And I don't know many law professors really who know much about it. So it's been sort of under the radar, although it was not under the radar for much of the 20th century, which is an interesting fact. Well, I was just at getting my ashes for Ash Wednesday here, and I think the responsorial psalm could be the epigram for my talk today, which says, "Be merciful, O Lord, for we have sinned." And truthfully, in the case of Buck versus Bell, we have all sinned. The country has sinned, and we have sinned by not recognizing and educating people about this reality, because eugenics, the perfecting of humanity, is not something just in the past. We're on the edge of a biotechnological revolution where we're going to be able to have the opportunity to, quote, perfect ourselves in many, many ways. So this case and the ideas behind this case are important to consider, because we are also about to enter a new age with a lot of new potential for eugenics. I don't think it'll be involuntary sterilization. I don't think the government's going to come in and force it on you, but that doesn't make it any less dangerous, probably, because it's voluntarily chosen as opposed to government enforced. Well, let's take a look at the case of Buck versus Bell. How could the United States Supreme Court in 1927, in an 8-to-1 decision, an overwhelming decision, decide that it was okay to involuntarily, that is to force, to mandate, to require that somebody be sterilized? This is a shocking concept for us today. But it was not shocking then. Now, why was that? Let me give you a couple of quick reasons. First off, at the latter part of the 19th century, you have, of course, Charles Darwin, but then you have people following up on Darwin, including his cousin Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics, meaning good birth. And the idea partly was, believe it or not, from animal breeding, right? You know, if you breed well, you get a better animal. So why couldn't we breed better human beings? And we could take evolution in hand instead of slowly through natural selection over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. We could speed that up and sort of take control of that ourselves, right? So there's a way in which we could, through involuntary sterilization and other measures, right, breed ourselves to a better population. This is also backed up, so you have this notion of social Darwinism, Herbert Spencer's idea. Social Darwinism was an idea that said, look, basically life is the fight of all against all, and the survival of the fittest is the rule of the land, right? So those who are more fit should survive, and they will survive. So why don't we make sure that people are fit? We'll sort of take over the evolutionary process and make sure that people are better. There was also a lot of concern about the cost of things like poverty and criminality and these kinds of things. Many state governments were very concerned about this, and they decided that involuntary sterilization would be a way to save them lots of money. Let me give you the quote from the Chicago Tribune. This is the quote after a talk about eugenics. Quote, and this is on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, breeding better folks held way to lower taxes. I kid you not, that was the title of the article. There was also, this was a period of time in the latter part of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century where there was a great fear of immigration. Of course, we know about immigration debates and discussions today, but the immigration at that time was huge compared to what we have today, relative to the size of the population. There was an enormous number of people coming in, particularly at that time, from Eastern Europe, right? There was this fear that these Eastern Europeans, the people from Poland and other countries, Russia, these Jews and Catholics coming in from these areas were going to dilute the Anglo-Saxon stock of the country. And I'm not making this up. This is what people were talking about at this time. So eventually in 1924, we passed an immigration law radically restricting the percentage of people who could come from those countries, and also requiring them to be tested to make sure that they weren't unfit under this notion of eugenics. So that was another idea at the time. There were also heredity studies going on. There were people who would go back and say, there's a famous case tracing a family starting in the Revolutionary War where one guy from the Revolutionary War had a regular family, his wife and children. They traced what happened to that lineage. Then he also had an affair with a tavern wench and traced all that happened with that family. And of course, you can guess what they found. You know, the tavern wench and her children were criminals and prostitutes, etc. And the other family did very, very well. Of course, this didn't take into account, for example, the fact that, you know, one's circumstances, right? What the nature that one is in helps to determine where one ends up. But this was taken to mean that because of heredity, this is what happened to these people. So the notion of heredity was beginning to take hold, right? You may have had, you remember Gregor Mendel, the pea plant experiments? How many of y'all had biology experiments, right? You know, when you put the pea plants together, what happens? Well, the idea was that you could do that with human heredity. Now remember, they didn't really have the notion of genes and DNA and all the things we've had in the latter half of the 20th century. What they knew is, with pea plants, it seemed to be very precise. So why not with human beings, and why not with human beings' moral and ethical values, right? Those were transmitted just like the colors in the pea plants. At least this was the theory at the time. So if people are passing this on, how do you stop that? Involuntary sterilization. Sterilize them so we don't pass on these negative genes, these negative moral and ethical qualities in folks. Well, eugenics was enormously popular. This may be hard to sort of conceptualize today, but every major political party, from liberal to conservative, socialist, labor unions, venture, Zions of industry, all of these folks were behind this notion of eugenics. So you could find support in all of these areas. And it was quite a list of people, famous people, who were behind eugenics and supported involuntary sterilization. People like Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Winston Churchill, to name a few. Margaret Sanger, who formed Planned Parenthood, was behind this. Billy Sunday, the famous evangelical preacher, So one person said he spent almost more time talking about involuntary sterilization than God. Sort of hard to figure. I'm not sure what that was about, but from many different areas of society, there came this cry that we had to stop. That we're going to be overwhelmed by all these idiots and imbeciles and criminals and prostitutes in the country. And part of this was IQ tests were taking off at this time. And in World War I, the Binet-Simon intelligence test was applied to soldiers. And it was a very crude test at that time. But what they thought they found was, oh my God, we're being swamped by a lack of intelligence. The country's stock, its intelligence, is going down. All the more reason we need to engage in voluntary sterilization. Now, laws began to be passed, and they were supported by, well, let me back up just a quick second. They were supported by eugenics groups. There was a group called the Eugenic Records Office up in New York. And this group ran a journal, had international conferences. It was supported by major groups like the Rockefellers, the Harrimans, so the major players in American society in terms of wealth and influence. And they went out and did these heredity studies. They supported model sterilization laws. So eventually, laws started being passed, beginning with Indiana in 1907, and then continuing through 1937, my home state, Georgia, the last to sign on. Now, there was a big political battle. Some states didn't pass sterilization laws. And my favorite story is the governor of Pennsylvania said, no, we will not have sterilization in Pennsylvania. So he vetoed it. And when he left office, they went to give him a little roast with some journalists. And they were giving him a hard time, saying, Governor, how could you not pass this law? He said, well, gentlemen, you journalists ought to be the most appreciative of the fact that I wouldn't pass a law that would sterilize imbeciles. So there were a number of options with eugenics. It wasn't always involuntary sterilization. Sometimes it was positive eugenics, they would call it, right? They would have county fairs. You would have model family contests. You become the model family. I'm not sure what that would be, but they would, a couple of kids, beautiful parents. I don't know. So they would. So that was sort of one way you promote, make sure when people got married that they were healthy, things like that. That was positive eugenics. We talked about negative eugenics and voluntary sterilization, but there were even people supporting euthanasia at the time. There was a doctor, Dr. Hazelton, up in Chicago in 1915. This became a very famous case where he euthanized a baby right after birth because it had some severe physical issues, right? It could live if he operated on it. It wasn't going to live if he didn't. He didn't operate on it. It died. And this became a nationally celebrated discussion of euthanasia. And once again, surprisingly, a lot of folks signed on that this was okay. The same people who were backing involuntary sterilization also backed euthanasia for children. And as far as I know, this is the first time that euthanasia was sort of brought out in the open as a possibility. Interestingly, two groups consistently opposed euthanasia. There's a book called The Black Stork, if you're interested. A fellow named Pernick wrote this book. And in the book, he went through all the newspapers across the country. He found two groups consistently opposing euthanasia. And these would, I think, logically be the same groups opposing involuntary sterilization. It was Catholics and fundamentalists and evangelicals. The two groups that had consistently opposed euthanasia. Most other groups, by and large, very supportive, including lawyers, doctors, folks like this. All right, so we also get the science which allows for involuntary sterilization, right? Vasectomy becomes a surgical procedure at the end of the 19th century. Cutting the fallopian tubes, a surgery called salpingectomy came into play. So the first time you could sort of do these kinds of surgeries. So now you have the means, rather than the crudity of sort of castration of males, was sort of your previous option. Now it can be done, quote, sort of harmlessly to the person. Although if you know anything about surgery, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was always a little suspect and dangerous. Well, let's go to the case of Buck versus Bell. So now we've got this nation which has broad political support for this idea of involuntary sterilization. There are fears about the degeneration of the nation's stock, how intelligent we are, how moral we are. There are institutional groups backing these measures, like the Eugenic Records Organization. There's science in the form of this, in genetics, and social science in the form of these heredity studies, backing these laws. And there's philosophy. We talk about social Darwinism, etc., behind this concept. So in Virginia, in 1924, they passed an involuntary sterilization statute. The governor wanted to cut down on the cost. His issue was primarily economic. If we do this, we'll have fewer criminals, we'll have fewer people that we have to pay from the state. Therefore, this is a good idea. Previous to that, they'd had some trouble actually passing it. So they needed somebody, right? They needed a person, a test case. And it was decided they wanted to do a test case and take it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, right, to get official approval of doing this. So they picked Miss Carrie Buck. Why Carrie Buck? Hard to say for certain, but Carrie Buck was under Virginia law, you had to go to one of their colonies for the feeble-minded, etc., to pick somebody. And actually the colony at Lynchburg, where she was, started out as a colony for epileptics who were also included in voluntary sterilization. Then it expanded that to including, those who were socially unfit, the feeble-minded, etc. Miss Buck lived in Charlottesville. Her mother had already been put in this colony for the feeble-minded because she had, quote, loose morals. Nobody really knew what that meant. The research hasn't really panned out exactly what that meant, but that was her reputation. Then she was put in a foster family, and when her foster family, the Dobbs, were out, their nephew raped her. She got pregnant, and how do you solve that? You put her in the institution. She's obviously loose, right? More often in these cases, not surprisingly, it's the women who suffer, the women who are going to be punished in these cases. No thought to what we should do to the relative. So they take her to the institution. Her mother's already there, and under the Virginia statute, they want to sterilize people who have a hereditary issue of feeble-mindedness. We already know her mother's in the colony. She is put in the colony, and she's got this small baby who they do this baby's newborn, and over the course, she's put in like in late 1924. The case goes through 1927, so the baby is very small. So how can you tell if it's unfit? Well, the only record in the record proving 3 generations of imbeciles in terms of her baby was one nurse said she looked kind of funny. That was it. And there was one doctor who gave her some kind of mental test for a year-old. I don't know what mental test that would be at that time, but she failed that. And he never stated in the record what that test was. Okay, so you've got 3 generations. And the Virginia statute was very specific about what you do. You first have to go at the colony in Lynchburg, right? They had to have a procedure where you appear before the director of the colony. He would, state that she was unfit, she needed to be sterilized. They had somebody appointed to be her guardian. They had somebody appointed, the guardian then appointed an attorney to help represent her. They went through the process. Basically, all you have to do is have the head of the colony say, you're unfit, and then you proceed to the circuit court, the county court, for the real trial. She gets to the real trial at Amherst. I don't know if you remember the film, but it shows you the county courthouse there. And it's one of the most amazing trials, as we'll see, I've ever heard of. It's probably the worst case of legal malpractice you could almost imagine if it's malpractice. It's literally legal collusion, as we'll see. But the witnesses are called. A nurse, an initial nurse who had not seen her, but she'd heard Carrie was passing notes at school to boys. 3 teachers, a distant relative, the head of an orphanage, none of whom had seen her, but knew something about some of her relatives were called. Finally, the nurse who actually looked at her daughter and said she looked funny was called. So after these witnesses, there's almost no evidence of 3 generations of imbeciles, very slight evidence. So then they call the experts, one of whom, Harry Laughlin, is the head of the Eugenics record office. He's never seen her. He just gets records that the colony is sending him. And guess what they tell him? Oh yeah, she's defective. Then they called the head of a local mental asylum who was in favor of sterilization, Dr. D Jarnet, who had never seen her and couldn't really remember exactly how Mendel's genetics worked. He couldn't even remember the right name for the surgical procedure, salpingectomy. He kept getting it wrong on the record. This is the expert. Finally, they called the one ace in the hole, which is Arthur Easterbrook, who's a caseworker for the Eugenics Records Office. Easterbrook says he has one day in Charlottesville, one day He meets quickly with the mother, gives her a quick IQ test. Yes, she's an imbecile. Never does any testing of Carrie. Goes to the baby and gives them a mental test and says, yep, 3 generations of imbeciles, no doubt about it. Well, one would wonder if you were a trial lawyer, which I was, you could have a field day with the lack of evidence here, right? It's basically hearsay and rumor. That's all we got here. Does her attorney object? No. Irving Whitehead. He asked for clarifications of terms, right? What does this really mean? He's almost like a second prosecutor when you look at the transcript. And so you might wonder to yourself, why is this attorney giving such a feeble defense? Well, let me tell you why. The prosecuting attorney, Aubrey Strode, and the defending attorney, Easterbrook, were boyhood friends. They were political allies. They were both involved in the Democratic Party in Virginia. They had supported one another politically, both in terms of writing statutes and running for races. Strode had just recommended a few weeks prior to the Buck versus Bell case. He had actually recommended Whitehead for a job that he got in Baltimore representing banks. Couldn't be a closer relationship. And that might seem bad, but then you find out Whitehead, the defense attorney, is actually on the board of the colony that's the one bringing the case against her to be sterilized. He's on the board. He's one of the founding members and on the board. That seems like a little bit of a conflict of interest, to say the least. And Dr. Priddy, the head of the colony, is also involved with these guys. He supported sterilization, but when Strode ran for Congress, the prosecuting attorney, he offered a carload of colony inmates to swell the crowd. It's almost like you couldn't make this up if you did a movie. You could not make this stuff up. So with that weak representation, not surprisingly, the circuit court finds that she should be sterilized. The case goes quickly through the appellate court in Virginia, in which on the appeal, the prosecuting attorney files a 40-page brief. The defense attorney, since he didn't present any evidence or any witnesses on her behalf, files a 5-page brief. Well, not surprisingly, it goes on to the U.S. Supreme Court. And there, it's met by Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., the preeminent U.S. Supreme Court justice ever, I think is fair to say, who was now in his, he was like 75 or something at the time, but still a revered figure, still at the height of his powers. They just had a celebration, I think it was his 85th birthday. They just had a celebration of his birthday. He was considered one of the most popular people in the United States at the time of this case. He goes through it. There's a couple of constitutional objections. One is equal protection, right? Why are you just getting people in a colony? Why aren't you doing this more broadly in the population, the sterilization? Holmes says, he describes equal protection as the last resort of constitutional arguments. This is nonsense. Some people will be sterilized, you send them out, new people can come in. Eventually we'll get to the whole state. We didn't say that part, but that's what it essentially meant. What about due process? Well, they followed all the procedures. But what about the substantive process? What about the public policy issues here? Holmes, who normally wouldn't wax very much about this, was a very big supporter of involuntary sterilization. So he came with sort of 3 reasons. One is utility, right? It's a utility of cost. If we do not do this, he made it clear that there would be tremendous cost in the case. He said this, quote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." I mean, even some of his fellow Supreme Court justices said it was brutal language that he used in this case. So, but partly under his theory of utility, right, we need to cut down the cost, right? The benefit to the state, if we cut these costs, there's a benefit to her. She gets to leave and live, can live a, quote, normal life. So benefit all around. Secondly, there's sort of a nationalism aspect to Holmes' opinion on this, right? And he served valiantly in the Civil War for the Northern Army. He knew he was wounded 3 times. He knew about sacrifice. And he said, if we can ask sacrifices like that of people, why can't we ask them to sacrifice their right to have children? For the good of the nation. For the good of the nation, we must do this. And finally, he was a big supporter of Herbert Spencer, social Darwinism, and he believed at the heart of law, it should support evolutionary progress. In other words, survival of the fittest. Let's allow society to advance on that basis. And he said this is the first principle on which law should be built. He said sterilizing imbeciles was getting at the real principle of reform. Reform meaning evolution, reform of the law, consistent with his notion of evolution. Well, there was one dissent, Justice Pierce Butler, the sole Catholic on the court. He was a very devout man. People speculated, in fact, people who knew him or like Catholic, like bishops and so forth, said he probably dissented because of his faith. They just wish he'd written an opinion. But he really didn't have much constitutional grounds. It's hard to say what he would have said given the dearth of evidence that had been presented from the lower court. Anyway, he didn't say anything, but he did at least dissent. There was a request for rehearing on the case. This was presented by the Catholic Men's Group, the National Council of Catholic Men, who paid for a request for rehearing because they didn't know this case was going on, but when they saw the decision, they said this has to be appealed. They went and paid Whitehead to request a rehearing on the case, questioning for the first time the basis of sterilization in eugenic theory. For the first time on this request for rehearing. Never occurred to Whitehead, this experienced trial lawyer, gee, I might want to do that. Well, surprisingly, why not? Since he was essentially in favor of it. I forgot this one detail. I should really include this. After this, the Virginia appellate court decided in favor of the state. Both Strode and Whitehead went to the colony directors. It's recorded in the minutes that they said, we have an excellent chance of success at the U.S. Supreme Court. There's two lawyers who are both saying we have an excellent chance. Whose side are you on? I mean, this is unbelievable that they actually allowed that to be recorded, but it's in the records. Holmes was thrilled with the case. He said of Buck versus Bell, it was one decision that I wrote that gave me real pleasure. He wrote in a letter to a friend. This gave him real pleasure. Well, as a result of Holmes' pleasure in that case, 37 states eventually would pass involuntary sterilization laws. It's estimated somewhere around 80,000 people were sterilized. The Nazis picked up on the fact of the Buck versus Bell case. They even contacted the head of the Eugenic Records Office, Harry Laughlin, brought him over to Germany as a consultant on involuntary sterilization because they wanted to do some involuntary sterilization as well. And Laughlin actually, you saw in the film, Laughlin actually types up, the Nazis are beating us at our own game. We need to speed up. Yeah, heaven forbid we let those Nazis come in first. Well, it's still on the states. I think there's two states still have it on their book, Mississippi and I forgot the other state. But it was repealed over time for a number of reasons. Partly the science didn't work. We found out the genetics that this was based on was entirely incorrect. And even at the time of the decision in 1927, many biologists didn't believe that the theory that eugenics was built on was correct. There was already a lot of science saying it was not correct. Holmes, who always prided himself on being up to snuff on science, apparently didn't want to read that part of the scientific literature. So the science didn't work, the Nazis used it. Pretty soon, involuntary sterilization became a lot less popular in the United States post-World War II. It took a while to peter out with the advance of civil rights, with the advance of personal reproductive freedom. In the 1960s and 70s, it ground to a halt. The last sterilization was done, as far as I know, in 1981 in Oregon. And what happened to Miss Buck? I ended with this. Miss Buck ended up in a retirement home in Charlottesville, Virginia. After living a productive life, she took care of her husband until his death, and then she went into the nursing home. And she was interviewed about a month before she passed away. They asked her about the case, and she said, "It doesn't do any good to hold grudges." I don't want to do that. And I asked her about whether she felt any anger about the case. So the woman who was terribly victimized by this case forgave the people who did this to her, which is an incredible act of Christian charity, in my opinion. Finally, her last public appearance before she got sick. She played the Virgin Mary in the Christmas play. The woman who gave birth to the world, Jesus Christ, that's who she played, a mother, the woman who had been sterilized. Could you have a more terrible irony in this case to wrap it up? Well, with that, I'm going to stop because I think we probably have some questions, and the panel may want to comment on this. But as they said in the responsorial psalm today, you know, we have all sinned. We need mercy, I think, for what happened in this case. Thank you.
Well, there are different ways we can do this. I think, first of all, if you want to turn the mics on there, you can. Hit the green, yeah, and that one will go green when you hit it. And I guess what I'd like to proceed with is just calling for questions, and first from the panel, and then we can open it up to the audience. Any comments or questions from the panel to begin with?
Well, I think the reason that Professor Lee asked me to be here is because of my practice under a theory of justice called restorative justice instead of retributive justice, which is what we are typically used to seeing, especially in our criminal justice system. You may know a little bit about what North Carolina has done in creating a task force of 5 to try to gather information, try to understand who the victims are, and try to figure out what the reparation to them should be. I guess my question, not to Professor Thompson, but to you is, and $50,000 is the suggested amount of money that that's being sent to the legislature for them to determine if that is a sufficient amount of money to pay reparation to the victims that we are still living. Do you think that is sufficient? Is there any amount of money that is sufficient? And I mean, my answer to that question is probably not. Is money the answer? In a world of restorative justice, the focus is not on retribution, it is on healing. It is on trying to understand who has been harmed, how have they been harmed, and how do we best address this. It is not done in a tribunal. It is done in a much safer setting where people actually come together in a way that they can have a conversation with each other about how they've been harmed and maybe who is